Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Purvanto Vasu. I'm a professor in the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center, and I'm the organizer of this Falconer Lake series. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Uday Nair. So Professor Uday Nair is a professor of atmospheric and earth science at University of Alabama in Huntsville. He earned his PhD in atmospheric science from Colorado State University. His research integrates numerical modeling, observational field campaigns, and satellite remote sensing to address both fundamental and applied problems in atmospheric science, with a focus on land-atmosphere interactions, boundary layer processes, mountain meteorology, and pollutant transport. And today he's going to talk about the first human planetary footprint, land use, and land property. Thank you.
Good evening. So, as Sukanta mentioned, one of my primary research work that I've been doing for over the last 25 years is looking at land use, land cover change, and how that affects the atmosphere. So primarily looking at clouds and rainfall. So if you have deforestation, if you have urbanization, how does that affect cloud formation? How does that affect rainfall? And so along the way, we have done several experiments trying to understand this type of phenomena. And so what I was hoping to share with you all today is a few of the cases that we have studied in different parts of the globe. And each of those cases had different scales at which they operate, and also different type of geographical setting. So some of it is over flat areas, some of it's over mountain regions, and some of it is over coastal regions. And so what I hope to leave you with today, when I'm done with all of this, is what I have learned from doing this for this long period of time, and what we should do in the future to understand this problem. So that is a quick introduction. And so whenever we talk about climate change, one of the piece that looms large in everybody's mind is carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. And so whenever we think about climate change, we kind of think about carbon dioxide changing from the late 18th century, and most of you have probably seen this graph before, which traces the changes of carbon dioxide from 1960 onwards, and it has reached about 430 ppm. So whenever we think about global impacts of humans, this is one of the pieces that comes to mind. But in reality, one of the first planetary footprints is from humans changing land use, utilizing land, and so clearing land and utilizing land in different ways. And so if we go back and look at the research studies, one of the first evidence for human changing land cover comes from as early as 90,000 years ago. And so this is from a paper by Thompson et al. And so this is over Malawi in Africa. So this is by the lake. And the study they looked at, they found evidence of from archaeological evidence of forests vegetation being burned, and then affecting the lake hydrology. So this is one of the studies that shows how long, much longer period of time, humans have had a footprint, and that is related to land use and land cover change. And so the land transformation is obviously an integral part of human activity. And this is really exemplified by one of the stories in Mahabharata. So this is one of the epic poems in India that was composed about 400 BC. And so this is a depiction of the tale of burning of the Khandava forest. And so this is from temple in underwater, and this is a representation of that story. And essentially what you see here is there's two characters that you can see, one on the left here and one on the right. And so these are two of the heroes in that story. One is Arjuna with the bow here and Krishna. And the story was that they were resting by this forest, Khandava forest, and they were approached by an old man who asked for food. And so they said, what kind of food would you like to eat? And so the person said that I want to eat Khandava forest. I want to eat all of it, including the creatures and all of the forest. But he said, I have a problem because the god of rain and thunder is going to drench the forest when I try to eat it. And so he revealed himself as I am Agni, the god of fire. And so I want to eat the forest by burning everything and eat all the creatures. But the problem is the god of rain is going to drench and put the fire out to protect some of the animals and creatures in there. And so they wanted the Arjuna to create like essentially a shield with his arrows so that he could keep the rain away. And so this is and he was able to burn the forest down and clear that whole area. And so this is the origin story of Indraprastha, which is a historical town, and it is not confirmed, but it's thought to be the location of New Delhi, which is the capital of India. So, so this kind of land transformation has been happening all around the globe. And what I want to share today is some modern tales of land use and land cover change, and the studies we have done related to this type of land use and land cover change. So the first tale I want to talk about is the bunny fence experiment. So this is the tale of Western Australian wheat belt, where a large area was cleared for agriculture. The second one I want to talk about is Misty Monad and disappearing golden frog, the tale of Costa Rican deforestation. And the last one I want to talk about is frozen oil, roar of lion, and rumble of the Arabian Sea, the tale of urban growth of medium-sized city in India. So just a little bit motivation for why I do this kind of studies. So whenever you clear land, what happens is it changes how the land interfaces with the atmosphere. So it changes the amount of energy, heat that goes from the surface to the atmosphere or back, and also moisture. And it can also, so by doing that, it can affect the meteorology, it can affect how the hydrology of the surface, and also atmospheric composition and ecology. All of this can be affected. Now, unlike greenhouse gas and aerosols, which also affect climate, land use and land cover foresting is inherently different because it is not location specific, it is location specific, while the other effects are spatially diffuse. So one good thing about it is you can base your study on one location, look at it for a long period of time, and kind of look at the effects in that specific place. And so this kind of provides a really good framework for understanding or attributing human effects on local weather and climate. And whatever methods we learn, we can extend that to carbon dioxide, aerosols, all that kind of effects. So, my talk is going to basically introduce the ways that I have done this for 2 or 3 places in the world, and then examine the lessons learned and what should we do to improve upon what we have learned. So I want to give a quick overview of how I conduct these studies. So first phase, how it has happened is always we come up with a hypothesis of how land use and land cover change affects the atmosphere. And that usually comes from prior studies. And a lot of the times in my case, I have looked at satellite data and you see signals that are appear to be related to people changing land and influence of that. And so usually we come up with a hypothesis on how land is influencing processes. And then the next thing that we do is actually use numerical models, which essentially solve how atmosphere evolves using computer modeling code. And there you can do all kinds of things. You can deforest, you can take out urban regions, and then we can look at the effects of what happens. And one of my favorite sayings about numerical models are they're like sausages, right? We all like them until we find what it's made of. And so what we do is we go ahead and see if we can confirm this further. So we go to the field and conduct field experiments to confirm these hypotheses. So usually the field experiments atmosphere is pretty complex, so it's really hard to just get the knowledge just from one piece. So usually it's an iterative process. So you got to go back and forth between models and observations. So as I talk through some of the examples, you will see that process going on. So the first tale I want to talk about is the bunny fence experiment. And so the bunny fence experiment is an NSF-funded field project that took place from 2005 to 2008. And so this happened in Southwest Australia. And one of the very interesting things about Southwest Australia is there is about 13 million hectares of native vegetation that was cleared for agriculture. And so this is a satellite image from one of the NASA satellites. And so just to give you some geographic context, this is Perth in Australia. And this line here, red line, is essentially a fence that is being built. So it's about 750 kilometers long, and it was built for the purpose of keeping the migration of rabbits, which was introduced by European migration into that region. And that fence never really contained the rabbits from moving to the other side, but that area, that fence kind of demarcates the region between agriculture and the native vegetation. So this is about, as I mentioned, 13 million hectares. And I want you to kind of remember these 2 points here, because that's where we conducted the field study. That's called Lake King. And so we sampled the native vegetation area and agricultural region to understand how energy fluxes and other things are different between the two.
Yeah. Are rabbits a native species there in Australia?
No, it was bought by Europeans.
Okay.
And
Okay.
what happened was it just, yeah. Rabbits did what they do, and it became a problem. So this is what the fence looks like from the ground. There's not much to look at, but it goes a long way. So one of the things that happened in this region by humans changing the land cover is we have a flip-flop of human footprint of really large proportions that you can see from space. And what that does is you have seasonally varying contrast between these two regions. So that includes surface albedo, which is, you can think about it as how bright the surface is. Then you have roughness, or how rough the surface is, and then transpiration. So that's how vegetation would transfer water from the soil to the atmosphere. And so this is a graph showing that flip-flop. So this is what I'm plotting here. On the y-axis is NDVI. So if you want to think about it, it is an index that you get from satellite data, and the value changes from about 0 to 1. 0 means there is no vegetation on the surface, and if it is 1, it means that it's very green and a lot of vegetation cover. So I have 2 lines here. One line is for agriculture, for the native vegetation, and so if you look at the native vegetation, that curve doesn't change very much this is expressed in Julian days, so as you go through the year, it doesn't change very much. But if you look, so this is what the native vegetation looks like, and it probably looks like that year rot, not much change. Now, if you look at the agricultural region during winter time, it's rain-fed agriculture, so you have wheat cultivation, and the surface looks like this, nice and green, but not as tall as the other side. And then when you go into summertime, you get harvest, and this is what the surface will look like. So as you can see, as the wheat grows, you're going to change the roughness, and also it's going to put more water into the atmosphere, all of that. And then all of a sudden, when you harvest, all of that goes away. So you have this huge flip-flop that of surface properties that is caused by human activity. So one of the things that happens, and this is what we saw from satellite data, is that clouds form preferentially over the native vegetation. So this is again the same satellite view, but from a different, same region, but from a different satellite. And I'm going to point out the fence area. So it's right along here, and you can see the brightness difference. So this is early in the morning, and I'm going to move this graph or the satellite data as time goes on. And one of the things that you see is the clouds kind of form and almost stop exactly along the fence as if it's a barrier. Yeah. One other response, so this is the first response that you see because of this human footprint. And you could probably accuse me of cherry picking one picture and showing you all this, but I do have published papers where that shows that this pattern is not just this one picture. But it's not always as clean as this either. But we can show that from statistical point of view, there is a pattern there, right? And the other response that you can see here is rainfall. So this is a plot of average rainfall from 1976 to 2001 divided by average rainfall from 1925 to 75. So the denominator here is the time when the clearing was taking place, and this time period is when the clearing is complete and this region is completely cleared out. And so what you find is that if you look, so this is the fence line, and what you find is the rainfall in this area during this time period of 1976 to 2001 is less compared to what was there before. And you can see that the pattern is, matches roughly with the pattern of the fence itself. And another response you see because of these changes are these pockmarked craters all over the agricultural region. And these are salt pools or lakes. And what is happening here is that when you have native vegetation, it has evolved to be in that region, which means it's very miserly in releasing water. So what it does is it taps into the water table underground and slowly releases that water over time. And so it keeps the water table under check. And what happens is when you take all that out and replace it with wheat, its roots don't go as deep and it's not there half the time. And so what happens is the water table control is lost and the water would start coming up. And then it comes up to the surface, it brings salt, and you get these things. And what happens once these salt pools appear is that the farmer has to go somewhere else because he cannot grow anything around this region. So because of all these fun stuff going on, we decided to go and do a field experiment to study this land atmosphere effects. And so this was called the BUFEX experiment or bunny fence experiment. And so this is a collaborative effort between University of Alabama in Huntsville, Murdoch University, and Flinders University in Australia, and Colorado Institute of Technology from Germany. And so we had essentially balloon-borne observations, airplanes, and we had measurement systems that we put on both sides of the fence to measure surface energy fluxes, how much moisture comes out of the ground, so that we can document the differences between these two areas. And so, as I mentioned before, we came up with all of this hypothesis based on analysis of satellite data and say there's a possible cause that we need to go look at. And so the hypothesis that we came up with was that there would be a change in surface energy fluxes, and this would impact the vigor with which you can push the air at the surface to the level at which condenses and form clouds. And the other hypothesis that we wanted to test was mesoscale circulation. So actually the differences between the two sites would actually induce a circulation in the atmosphere. And that might be one of the reasons why you have the shift of precipitation. And then the other aspect that we wanted to look at was there might be differences in aerosols in the atmosphere, because when you have agricultural activity, you have dust being picked up, other kinds of biological activity, all of that. And so this could potentially affect, the type of particles that form in the clouds and how that would form rainfall. So I want to quickly talk about some of the results that we found. And so these are some graphs of energy and what is the planetary boundary layer height. So planetary boundary layer height, you can think about, you put energy at the surface, and that is influencing the atmosphere. So how high does that influence go? You can think about that as boundary layer height, probably. And so I have a plot here at different times of the day. You have agriculture here on one axis, native vegetation on the other axis. So if it's above or below the 1-to-1 line, you can decide where it's higher and where it's lower. And what we find out is that there's consistently higher boundary layer heights over the native vegetation. And then we also find higher amount of heat coming out of the ground over the native vegetation region. But over agricultural region, there's more moisture coming out, just because wheat doesn't know when to shut off like the native vegetation. It just keeps transpiring, right? So this kind of gives validation of some of the hypotheses that we were looking at. But then one thing that we did not find is mesoscale circulations. We didn't really find any substantial changes. But surprisingly, some of the other things that we found out was it was actually affecting larger scale atmospheric motion in systems. And so this is one of the patterns that we noticed is that preferential cloud formation often occurs when there's a feature in the atmosphere called the West Coast trough that forms there. So it's essentially modification of atmospheric pressure patterns. Because of the heating of the land, it can actually form. So you have the pressure lines here. And as you can see, so this is the 17th December 2005 morning. Next day, you can see that the pressure line has kind of made a U shape. So that is a trough. And then when you get to the 18th December evening, it has actually formed a closed low pressure system. So this is because of the heat generating a low pressure system there. And one thing that we did was between these 2 days, the first day was very clear. And when it's clear, that's when you can do the analysis of boundary layer heights, because there's some clouds obstructing, causing problems. And so this graph is actually showing the variation of PDL height, and then you're actually plotting what is called lifting condensation level. That is, lifting condensation level is how high do you have to push air at the surface for it to condense and form a cloud. Boundary layer height is how high is actually the air going because of the heat input. And what you find here is that later in the day, over the native vegetation, you have boundary layer heights that would exceed the lifting condensation level. And this is the second day, you actually see clouds that are forming preferentially over one side. And so one of the things that we decided to do using computer models is we actually model at evening time at this time, no, evening time, what the pressure system would look like with and without, in the model, we can do whatever we want. And so in the model, we assumed that this agricultural clearing didn't happen. And then we also did the model with the clearing there. And so then we took the difference of the pressure. And what we find is that when the pristine vegetation is there, this pressure system is going to be a lot stronger. Okay. And so the numbers come out to about close to 1.2 millibars, which is quite substantial. And one of the difficulties we have with models is they don't always do what you want it to do. Even though it replicated all of this, it didn't follow any clouds that day because the model, for whatever reason, it didn't push air up to where it would condense. So we had to look at some other proxy to analyze what is going on. And so what we did was we took the difference in boundary layer height between the two simulations. And what we find is that if there is no clearing that is happening, then the air would get pushed up by in excess of 0.9 or almost a kilometer more. And so the potential for forming clouds is high. This is what we found out. And we repeated the same experiments for wintertime. And wintertime, sometimes the same kind of system forms. The heat low does form during, or industrial trough does form during wintertime too. And we kind of see the same kind of pattern. We look at the pressure differences. It creates really large pressure differences even during wintertime. And you get differences in flow. And for this particular case, we were actually able to, the systems did produce rain. So we were able to use the model to figure out what it's doing to the rain. And what you find out is that if you have the pristine vegetation present, then you would increase rainfall to the west. But pattern is a little bit complicated, but some of the features that you see here are reminiscent of the earlier figure that I showed for the rainfall. But this is just one case study. You got to do this for many, many case studies to integrate and get the pattern. But the story is that it does have an effect on change in rainfall and clouds. And one other thing that happened was we sat around there for 3 weeks at a time, looking at world go by. And we had to release balloons, but in between we had a lot of time to sit around, reflect, look at things around us. And some of us were comparing notes, and we made the observations that you form dust devils during summertime there. And somebody said, "Hey, we seem to see a lot more dust devils on the agricultural side. What is going? You think it was real?" So you cannot make that conclusion by just looking at 5 dust devils and say, "Hey, I saw 5 more here, so that is real." So, but we don't have the time to go around and count dust devils. That was not our job. So what we did was we did the next best thing that we could do. We looked at theory and said, okay, is the conditions for forming dust devils better between one side and the other? And so we did, we can calculate some ratios. This is called W star over U star. These are scalar velocities for boundary layer. And the idea here is for dust devils to form, you need 2 things. One thing is that you have to have convection. So that is represented by W star. But once you get convection going and you get rotation going, if there is too much friction, then that vortex would slow down and not be able to form. And so that is represented by U star. So if you take the ratio of how much convection there is, so if there's too much friction, this ratio would be less. And that, so people have done experiments and come up with the idea that over this ratio over 5 is what is needed for dust devil to form. So we had all the data to do this computation. So we did that computation. And what we found out was agricultural side does have the tendency to form more dust devils. So lastly, one of the things I want to look at here is aircraft observations of cloud particles. So we had the German group had a glider, and they collected data for cloud particle size. And so this is a measurement of what cloud particles look like on the agricultural side. And the green one is essentially what you find over native vegetation. And so what you find here is that over the agricultural side, the cloud particle size tends to be smaller and more numerous. And when you go to the native vegetation side, you have a peak at much larger size cloud particles. So the implication of this is that for rain to form when you have clouds, when you reach a certain threshold size, your possibility of forming rain becomes higher. So what this studies measurements is showing is that there is some differences in cloud particle size, and that may play a role. And then we talked about where those aerosols are coming from, and the person who made the measurements said he noticed quite a bit of uptake of particles when he flies over the Salt Lakes, actually. And so one of the questions that is still unanswered is that are those biogenic or biology generated aerosols? So, by the way, the Salt Lakes does have some type of vegetation. There's only one vegetation that grows on it, and that's the one it feels this generating this biological aerosols. So we were able to do some idealized modeling experiments. We could take combinations. Okay, if you put more aerosols to our agricultural side, if you put more aerosols to our natural side, you're going to make the size distribution of cloud particles match with what you see here, these two patterns. So we can play this game, and we found that if you just change land cover, it's about 8% change in rainfall happen. But if you add the aerosol particles, then it can go up to 21. But then if you put in these kind of shapes, then it goes up to 42. So what these numbers means is that if you combine the aerosols and if you combine the land cover change, that is what gets you the biggest change in rainfall. So all these signals that we're seeing in the cleared regions seem to indicate a reduction in rainfall. So this is just an overview of what we found out. So this was a really interesting study for me because you have land clearing for agriculture. It changes surface vegetation and surface and vegetation changes. So you get energy flux change, you get heat changes that leads to differences in clouds, reduction in rainfall. But you also have hydrology changing, and it's creating salt pools, which is also generating aerosols. Then you have agriculture. By its own nature, it's going to generate aerosols. You got dirt being picked up, you got harvesting processes, you put in fertilizer, all kinds of things are going on. So that generates aerosols. And then the changes in surface vegetation adds increased dust levels. So you're increasing processes that takes the aerosol from the surface and put it in the atmosphere. So all of this kind of combine and give a feedback to the clouds. So, and all of them work towards reducing the rainfall. So it was a really nice, study that I really enjoyed because of all these complex processes that you're creating because of one small change that you're making. Okay. So the next one I want to talk about is the Misty Mountain disappearing golden frog. This is the tale of Costa Rican deforestation. So the Misty Mountain I want to talk about today is Mono Verde, Costa Rica. So just to give you a geographical context, this is Nicaragua, this is Costa Rica, this is Panama. And so the mountain I'm going to talk about is right here. So you see so this is terrain. So this is the continental divide, and these are all mountains. And the specific mountain I want to talk about is Mono Verde, which is a tropical forest whisper. So if you see this V-notch pattern, that point goes right towards that Costa Rican forest. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Monteverde. Monteverde is a tropical montane cloud forest. So what does tropical montane cloud forest mean? Cloud forests are essentially ecosystems characterized by frequent and prolonged immersion in clouds. So essentially there's clouds sitting at the top of the mountain, and you have an ecosystem that takes advantage of that environment. And so what the plants do is they harvest water from the clouds. And so that is one of the major sustenance for the ecosystem itself. So that drives all the chain of ecosystem that is there. So typically these type of forests occur about 1,500 to 3,500 meters, but if you go to coastal areas, it can come down to about 300 meters or so. So if you go to a cloud forest, this is what it looks like. It is really neat. So what is one of the things I want to talk about is the ecological importance of tropical montane cloud forests. So a long time back, the study was done by Myers. This is in 2000, and he identified what is called biological hotspots. So all these red areas that is mapped on in the globe are biological hotspots. And the idea of this hotspot is that they support about 20% and 16% of plants and vertebrates, right? And they retain only 25% of its original primary vegetation cover. So the study identified these areas as hotspots because if you want to conserve the biological diversity, these are the areas that we need to target. Now, I could go ahead and put all the locations where cloud forests occur. And so these blue arrows point to those locations. So the cloud forests generally are found at the heart of all these hotspots. So mountain-generated ecosystems are very localized, endemic populations. So they're even more threatened than the lowland forests. Because you find species, you find only in one small mountain somewhere. And so it is important to think about conserving these forests. And there's also hydrological importance for these forests. So I'm going to show you a cross-section right along Monteverde. This is my bad diagramming here, but think about this mountain. Here's the Caribbean Ocean. And then you have the mountain here. Now, if you go to about 1,300 meters, the rainfall you get at that height is about 6,390 millimeters per year. Now, what I call here is horizontal rainfall is about 350 millimeters. What I mean by horizontal rainfall is all the fog that is being sucked up by vegetation and how much you get, water you get out of it. So at 1,300 meters, this is how much you get. But when you get to the top of the mountain, 1,500 meters, straight down rainfall is 4,310 millimeters. Now, the forest sweeping the water out is 3,560 millimeters. Now, if you're going in the tropical regions, a lot of the dams are fed by streams that come out of the mountains. So you can think about the importance of hydrology in this region. Now, if you go to the other side, you will again see that that amount decreases. But the point I want to make is at the top of the mountain, that in those regions, the amount of water that comes out of these forests are huge. And you need those trees to harvest that water. So the trees are evolved to drive water out of those clouds. So some of the ecological changes at Monteverde. Monteverde has experienced an increase in frequency in mist-free days. And it also experienced population crashes. And so one of the iconic species that disappeared is the golden frog that is shown in this picture here. And so then there were questions about why are these changes happening there? And so one of the things that was mentioned was climate change. And there was a paper in 1999 that proposed the following hypothesis. So if you have a mountain like this and you have some sea surface water temperature, maybe your clouds are going to form like this, and it's your cloud base height where it intersects the mountain is going to be right here. Now, the hypothesis that they proposed was if you have higher water temperature, this clouds are going to move to a higher height, and essentially you're going to have areas of the forest where you don't have that cloud immersion. And so they proposed this as one of the costs for a lot of ecological changes happening there. But one of the ideas that we looked at was, what about deforestation? Deforestation can potentially affect clouds too. And so if you look at all the green regions that you're seeing here are forests or forested regions in Costa Rica, and the yellow is where it's deforested. And so Monteverde is somewhere around here. And so if you look in the upland regions of it, you have deforested, large tracts of deforested land. And so the idea that we looked at is if you have forests, you have a lot of water vapor coming out, and those are going to go up the mountains and form clouds at some level. Now, if you take out those forests, you have more heat coming out and less moisture coming out. And so you would move the clouds up the slopes. And so we did models at first, and we simulated at first just regular fair weather cumulus, and we looked at how the cloud base height would change as a function of day if you have forest versus if you have pasture. And so what we found out was when you deforest, your cloud base height goes up. And you can take the difference here, you can conduct statistical analysis, and you can actually show such statistically significant pattern of increase in clouds. So this was idealized experiments. So we did later more detailed experiments where you had all the terrain, we represented everything correctly, and then we did, forested scenario, deforested scenario, and what it is planned. And what we find is a consistent pattern of when you remove forests in the lowland regions, your cloud base height in the mountain areas go up. Okay. And also we found out that the area of the mountain covered by clouds also change. So when you deforest the lowlands, that area covered by clouds also decreases. And so we had a field experiment called land use cloud interaction experiment. And so we go in and collected radius hunts. We released balloons of measurements over forested site, pasture site next to each other. We calculated the lifting condensation level, which is how much you got to push the air up for the clouds to form. And we found differences of very similar to what we modeled. So again, we were able to go ahead and validate this. So the last one I'm going to talk about is a study that I did during COVID. I was bored, been staying at home and doing stuff. And so this is called frozen coconut oil, growth of the line, and rumble of the Arabian Sea. Tail of urban growth in the medium-sized city in India. So the city happens to be my hometown. It's called Trivandrum, Tiruvananthapuram. So this is the southernmost part of India, and the red outline here is the city of Trivandrum, or Tiruvananthapuram. And so you would possibly ask me, what does frozen coconut oil, roar of a lion, and rumble of the Arabian Sea has to do anything with the city going? Okay, so I'm going to convince you there's some connection here. So let me talk a little bit about the motivation. This is the house I grew, when I was growing up. This is where my house was built. This is my grandmother's house. Okay, so a few things I want to point out. There's, you can see soil, you can see grass, you can see vegetation, open windows, all kinds of fun stuff. Now, what does it look like now? This is what it looks like now. This is what the ground looks like. There's no soil, it's all paved. Okay, so it's my grandmother's house, what it looks like now. Everything is paved, there's no soil showing anywhere, right? So one of the things that when I was growing up, when it gets to about December, it gets cold. You all will laugh if you're there when I say it gets cold, but it's cold to me, right? And my dad used to put, so these are ventilators, right? Open areas where air would come in. And so to keep the temperature, to keep it warm, he would put newspapers on, cover this up. And so another thing that used to happen was like we used to have coconut, we used coconut oil quite a bit. And so when it gets to about December, coconut oil would freeze. Okay. And then there was mist. When we go out and look at grass, there was always mist in the grass. And my home is somewhere right about here. So this is a Google figure. The beach is right here. It's like 2 or 3 kilometers, somewhere around there. And then there's something called Napier Museum here. Okay. So in the old days, this is what Napier Museum looked like. There was lions in like pitiable cages, right? When I was growing up, there wasn't very nice. But now they have nice open air areas. They hang out over there, right? But when we were growing up, early in the morning, you would hear the lions roar. And I could hear it. We can hear it at our home.
Lion sleeps tonight.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing that we used to hear quite a bit was this is Arabian Sea right here. And so there's my favorite beach. And when the waves come crashing in the morning, you would hear the rumble. And you could hear it all the way at my home. It's very faint, but you can hear it. So the beach itself, there's me, and the beach long time back. This is what the beach looks like. As you can see, the beach has changed too. There's concrete almost all the way up to the water. This scene used to be in the old days. I can imagine what this would have looked like from satellite. You would have seen a lot more green. Okay. Now, if you look, the green is somewhat rare to see. And so we were sitting around one day and talking with my brothers, and we talked about the old times, and we talked about how we used to be able to hear the lions roar, right? The waves crashing down, all this kind of fun stuff. And we were saying, you don't hear or see that. You don't see coconut oil freezing. You don't hear the sounds. What's going on? So after getting a PhD and some education, I thought I should think about this, right? And so the question that came to my mind is, does land use, land cover change, especially urbanization that has happened in this region, have any role in doing this? And so one of the things that we did was we used NASA satellite data to kind of study how this area grew, what happened to this region, how did the climate around here change? And so this was the population growth that happened in this region, 1955 to about 2000 or so. Not much happening, but look, from 2000 on, it just took off like rock, right? And it's supposed to keep growing, and the curve is just going to keep going up. And so we took the satellite data. One of the things about NASA satellite data is there's a consistent record for 20, 25 years. So I can do a 20-year period study because it's the same satellite looking over the same place. And so one of the things that you could do is you could figure out what kind of land cover is there from satellite data. And so you can figure out, for example, UV is urban land cover. And so I mapped the land cover in 2001. This is what the city looked like right here. Now, in 2019, the city looks like this. It has grown quite a bit. And there are 2 meteorological stations right here and here. So I thought I could take a look at that and see what is going on there. So we looked at how the different land cover has changed. And what we find is urban region has grown quite a bit from about 46 square kilometers to about 73.88 square kilometers. So we were able to figure out the kilometer squared of the urban region, and this is what the graph looks like for urbanization. So as we can see, about year from 2001 to about 2010, not much happening, but from 2000 on, 2010 on, it just took off. So I get a control and I get an experiment here if I separate these two time periods. So one of the things that I did was we went and looked at land surface temperature. So you can, from satellite, you can map what the land surface temperature looks like. So this is a map of daytime land surface temperature from 2000 to 2009. So you can see the footprint of higher temperatures to 306K or so. This looks like this. Now look at what that looks like from 2010 to 2019. As you can see, the heat signal of the city has become quite large. And you can look at nighttime temperature, and even during nighttime that hangs around, right? And then we can look at vegetation. This is the same NDVI I showed you before, and you can see the city, all the green going out of the city, and a lot of those regions becoming not very vegetated. And so I can actually average the daytime and nighttime LST, and then I can create a trend of daytime and nighttime LST. So this is what I've done here is I've taken out the seasonality and just looking at non-seasonal patterns. And what you see is a really steep climb of land surface temperature, both during daytime and nighttime. And I can look at how the albedo or how bright the surface is has changed. And you can see the city has the brightness changing as this number goes up. It's becoming more and more bright. And you can look at emissivity. Emissivity is how effective the land surface is at emitting energy. So that has decreased within the city, which means it's trapping more heat. And so the question is, what is causing this change in land surface temperature? And we looked at all the different factors, and the only explanation that you can come up with is that it is because the partitioning of energy or more heat is coming out of the ground. Because before there were trees, all of the energy coming in, part of it goes into bringing out moisture. Now instead of coming moisture, it's all coming out as heat. So are there changes in surface meteorology? There's a lot of graphs here, so I won't go through all of them. But I can show you, here's temperature trends, right? Maximum, minimum, mean. And then you have wind speed, and I showed wind speed here. The wind speed has been continually going down over the last 2-3 decades. So if you put all these, so there's changes in meteorology, but then the question is, we don't know if this is coming because of the city or is it because large scale climate is changing. So the question is, how do you separate the two? And this is where we kind of utilize what is called reanalysis data. So we use NASA reanalysis data. And the idea being, I could take a point here in the ocean. So the air that the city sees is coming out the ocean. So before the air gets to the city, it is not being affected by urban, but it's being affected by large-scale changes in climate. So I could use this as a proxy to figure out that effect, the large-scale climate effect. And then we can take that up from the city effect. And so that's what I'm doing here. We constructed before the city grew, so that is, by before 2000. I used that data and combining it with the data here, I constructed a regression model that would predict the average trend of temperatures. And then it does, but I constructed it before the city grew. So it is tuned to the effects of the city as it existed before. And then we can apply that model and forward it to after the city grew. And you can take the difference between the two, and that will be the residual effect or the effect due to just the city growing. And so that is what you see here. So even after you take out the large scale climate effect, you get about 0.6 degree change happening over this time period. And we can also look at the two stations, and I can separate it out, before the city grew and after the city grew. And some of the things that we see is that one of the stations is close to the coast. And if you look at that station, you would see the wind speed picking up earlier in the day, 10:30. So there's a sea breeze effects. And what you see here is that is all shifted to later in the day. And same thing that we find with moisture and other effects. So the point here is that it seems to be affecting the sea breeze that is happening in the region. So what does this have to do with frozen coconut oil? Well, I could take the minimum temperature that is in the region and do a little bit of analysis of it. So if I remember correctly, the coconut oil freezes at about 25 degrees or so. So as you see, the minimum temperature is working its way towards 25 degrees. Okay? And the other thing that you have to consider is outside temperature is not the same as inside temperature, especially if you have concrete houses. Okay? So this is a study showing the difference between inside and outside temperature in houses. So you might have up to like 4 or 5 degrees difference. So here's what's going on. Our minimum temperature has been going up, which is why we don't put newspapers on the ventilators anymore, which is why the coconut oil is not freezing anymore. Now, what about the lines roar and the oceans rumble? So some of the studies, so this was done by a study done by Garstang that looked at propagation of sound waves and how that is affected by vertical structure of temperature in the atmosphere. And so one of the things that happens in the atmosphere is that you would form an inversion, what is called an inversion, where you would have increase in temperature with height at certain level. And that traps all kinds of things, including sound wave propagation. So you almost form a small tube through which sound can propagate. And so this graph here is showing when the temperature, that inversion is not there, how it would affect the range over which elephants can transmit sound. And so you may go from 2 kilometers to 10 kilometers. So my hypothesis is that nighttime urbanization and heat are all going up. This inversion is changing. So potentially it could be because of that, but I should also mention there's all kinds of other reasons too. There's more environmental sounds that are there. There are buildings in the way, so it could be all of that too. But this is what inspired me to kind of go and look at this and commonly debate that people think after they get a degree. So this kind of summarizes the 3 kind of studies that I've done. And one of the things that I want to talk about is, okay, these are all trying to look at attributions. And what are some of the issues that we have come across when we did this attribution studies? And there are a few issues. So whenever we have field experiments, there are 2 things that are going on. We always go and do the field experiment after whatever we are trying to study has happened. So it is really hard to find a control. So if you look at my experiments, I always have like an area that has not changed and areas that has changed side by side. But the problem is things are not still the same. There's difference in location, there's difference in terrain, all kinds of things. So how do we get around that problem? That's one of the things that we need to address. And the other one is a lot of these field experiments, it's like $1 million. And we have all these instruments, and we get 3 weeks to figure out something that is happening. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to look at clouds and rain. So you got to find 3 days out of 21 days that you're going out to study a phenomena and catch it. And if you get 2, you're lucky if you get 2 days. And then you don't have any statistics to say this is real, right? Or you got to do a lot of, you don't get the satisfaction of doing that. Right? And so one of the things that I thought about is, can you put together an observation network? So if you think a city is going to grow in some region, why not go ahead and put an observation site there, like a network of observations, and let the city grow into it. So you have a control already. You study for 5 years using that observation network. And then the city comes in and we can look at the transition of changes happening and have a long data set that you can use to study. So this is an example right here. Look at this. The city is just like it's growing. And we can kind of predict when it's going to happen and put your network there. And the other part is how do we, when you change land cover, you're going to change constantly perturb the atmosphere. So like you're going to change heat, moisture, all of that. But it doesn't always lead to rain. So is there a place where we can figure out when you change the surface, it is always going to, or persistently going to affect clouds and rain? So why not put your observational networks in places like that? And so the idea is that if you have a city, and if the city is by the mountains, then the air that you're going to change just constantly go up the mountains. And when you go up the mountains, there's always clouds falling and rain falling. So you get your statistical significance will go up if you go and study in a place like that. The other place that you can do is over coastal regions. You have sea breeze, and there's these circulation patterns called horizontal convective walls. They collide and they generate rain over those regions all the time. And some of our studies show that if you change urbanization, you change the convective walls. So these are two areas where you can go and do this kind of studies. And another good thing about this is that numerical models never want to do things that you want them to do, right? It doesn't form clouds just because you want them to. But if you have terrain, the model behaves very well because the forcing is very strong. So you get 80% prediction rate places. So, what would I like to do in another 3-4 years, 5 years, somewhere around there, is that I would like to establish a network like this and collect long-term observations over a city, either by the coast or by the mountain. If you all have ideas on how to generate some funds for that, I would love to hear about it. And that's all I got for today. Sorry I took more time than I should have. Thank you.